Hello, I'm Michael Bull, and welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Show, your source for insightful analysis and enlightening discussions. And we certainly have some enlightening discussions for you today. We're going to talk about sales contracts and leases. Look, leases are the backbone of commercial real estate. They provide the income and the safety for the tenant. And it's going to be fun today. We're going to have an attorney sort of representing each side, a landlord tenant. Then we're going to have two attorneys representing opposite sides on a sales contract. Let's start with leases first. Please welcome John Neville. He's an attorney with Arnold Golden Gregory, and he's going to take the position of the landlord today, although he represents landlords and tenants all over the country. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Also, please welcome Ryan Rivera. He's with Hartman, Simons, and Wood. He also is a real estate attorney who represents landlords and tenants. And today he's going to take the side of the tenant. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, we appreciate it. And gentlemen, first, let's talk about this situation. All right, so we have a landlord who wants full personal guarantee of the tenant. He wants corporate guarantees of the tenant. The tenant doesn't want any of those guarantees. So tell me, first of all, John, why is the landlord requiring these types of guarantees? The tenant doesn't think it's proper.
Well, if we're asking for a guarantee, I've got to presume that the deal has already been underwritten, the business deal. Mm-hmm. Usually when the deal gets to us as attorneys, rent rates are set and credit's been examined. And the guarantee is a result of there not being enough credit with whoever's signing the lease. A lot of times, people will form a new company. And when they form a new company to sign a lease, there's no money in that entity. So you need a guarantee to actually get some credit into the deal. And in your example, if we're asking for a personal guarantee and a corporate guarantee, I've got to imagine that number one, the tenant entity has no credit, and number two, the entity that's the guarantor probably also has very little credit. That's why you would want to go to a personal guarantee.
And Ryan, why does your tenant say that's ridiculous?
Well, first off, we're obviously not going to give both. But I think it's important to distinguish between the type of tenant. If I'm representing a larger national anchor tenant, obviously you probably will not be getting, certainly not getting a personal guarantee, most likely not getting a corporate guarantee either. If it's a local, maybe a franchise operation or some sort of local mom and pop, certainly understand the need for a personal guarantee. I'm going to want to limit that though, especially if this might be first business, second business that my client is operating. We might be looking to grow further down the road, and the last thing we want to have exposure to is unlimited personal guarantee on each location. So the first thing I'm going to ask John is that at some point this has to burn off.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that this my way or the highway is not good for business for a landlord or a tenant. So we're going to look at some ways to maybe mitigate risk, some ways to negotiate and work out these things. So what would be another position that you'd be willing to look at as a landlord rep?
Well, I mean, I'd first call Ryan up and try really hard to get every guarantee I could get. But I think at the end of the day, again, we got to remember that the guarantee is a credit facility. It is what's used to underwrite the value of the lease. It's used to give the landlord security they're going to get paid. So the more comfortable I can get that my tenant is actually going to pay me, then the more comfortable I can get possibly talking about watering down the guarantee, putting a dollar limitation on that guarantee, or some other creative structures. So typically, Michael, what I'm going to look for is I want to see that tenant performing well. I want to see some sales data to show increasing trends, and I want to see some stability in the market. So to use Ryan's point, if he represents a franchisee that maybe when we do our first deal has 2 stores in the market, if they have 20 stores in the market, 3 or 4 years down the road, I would say that my tenant entity is probably a lot more stable because that business is now established in our market. So I think guarantees can evolve.
So you might be willing to do some sort of burn off where when certain things happen, maybe the guarantee goes away, and what might be some examples of that?
Going away might be a little aggressive. I would say, I know certainly that's what Ryan would ask for, and I would ask for it too if I were a tenant, but I think certainly you can diminish the liability under that guarantee, whether it goes away or just gets reduced. And it's tied again to number of stores in a market. Right. It's tied to sales figures. It's tied to not being any defaults. that we want to see the tenant's been a good tenant and they've performed where they need to perform. And if you get positive indicators like that, you can usually have some room to negotiate.
And Michael, I will say for the burn-off, I would not want to tie it to number of stores in the market, because if this is going to be only 1 or 2 locations that we're going to operate, so long as you've received your rent, we've performed, we have not defaulted under the lease, we certainly want to see it burn off at some point, particularly maybe if we have an option term.
I would agree.
So if we go into an option period, there's been no defaults during the main term, we've paid our rent, at that point we'd like to say, it should burn off. Now, as to the limitation, I'm going to ask for that from day one, because we don't want to, if there's a default year 1, year 2 of the lease, we don't want to have full exposure from what might be a 5 or 10-year term. So commonly we'll ask for what we call a rolling guarantee, which would be from the date of the default, the landlord could recoup maybe 12 months, or on the high end, 24 months of rent from that point in time. That way we're not full exposure, but I know John's going to take issue with that.
The problem with the 24-month roll out of the gate is that effectively, if I'm a tenant, I can book that as a 24-month lease, right? Because I can know that if I have a tenant entity that has no money in it, and I have a guarantee that's limited at 24 months, then effectively, the risk has been mitigated by that operation, by that business at 24 months worth of rent. As a landlord, especially on a credit deal, where I'm looking to have that lease count towards the value of my asset, it's a huge financial difference, Michael, as you know better than anyone, to have a 2-year deal versus a 10-year deal. And to get the full value for the asset, we need it booked as a 10-year deal. So, this goes beyond the scope of the conversation, but I'd rather talk about sales kickouts or other things to give you the protection from a failing business than to give you a 2-year liability cap out of the gate.
And I understand your position, and I think that's the benefit of both of us sitting on both sides of the table, being landlord and tenant in our daily practice. I will say, ultimately, bottom line, it's a business call. Working on a deal, as a matter of fact, yesterday, where the guarantee issue arose, and they wanted the rolling guarantee from day one. I was on the landlord side on that particular deal, and we weren't comfortable with it, but we could tell that tenant just didn't have an appetite for the risk. So that was a decision where the landlord ultimately said to get the deal done, we agreed to it. Now, to your point, I think the common compromise is, so long as again, no defaults, rent has been paid during the first maybe 2-3 years, at some point then the rolling guarantee might kick in.
Totally agree.
And there's also some other alternatives, right? So quickly some other alternatives throw in, but I guess one could be if the landlord is spending a lot on a build out for sale on an office property, they might suggest, the landlord might say, well, look, guarantee that what I'm spending to build the space out for you, right? Maybe amortize it where it reduces over time.
Right.
That's better than nothing, even though I think that gets the landlord just back to the starting line, right? Because the problem is the landlord's spending money to build the space out, so the landlord's going in the hole, right? So if you're getting a guarantee just for that allowance, effectively all the tenants saying, I'll get you back to break even. Well, no landlord's going to do a deal just to hopefully not lose money. Right. The landlord's doing a deal so they can make money on the rental stream and improve their value.
Good point. And as you said, it's always business driven. If he wants that tenant, he wants that tenant. And I've also seen landlords in a situation where they really needed a tenant. They were doing some build out and things, and they said, well, look, I understand you don't want any personal guarantees, but what if you guarantee the lease if you're in the space and not paying? So in other words, if you can't pay, you get out so I can release it, fine. But if somehow you're blocking up my space and not paying, then you become personally liable. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, isn't there?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think the key is that you don't, that one side doesn't say it's this way or the highway. Look, there's a lot of ways to work this out. Well, let's talk about another argument that a lot of people have on leases in retail, and that's co-tenancy, right? So the landlord doesn't want any co-tenancy in the deal. Ryan, your tenant wants to be able to have a lot of rights if the anchor tenant goes dark or moves out, right? So why do you need that provision in your smaller or mid-sized tenant's lease, that if that anchor leaves, that they have rights?
And you hit on it. So if it's a smaller or mid-sized tenant, obviously a lot of times those anchors will help drive foot traffic to the center. It's going to help drive my business. So it's important, especially going in as maybe a smaller shop tenant, whether it be local or national, that those, I call them the named inducements, the anchors are there and operating. I'll tell you, the other thing I'm going to ask for maybe is, if I'm going into a center where there might be a department store or some sort of anchor that's important to my business, I'm going to ask for that. I'm also going to ask for a percentage of occupancy of the shopping center. Sometimes 75, 80% of the center being open and operating for a retail business. Something, again, the retail foot traffic that's really driving and helping my sales.
So that makes sense. And John, a lot of tenants have found how important that is, but so have landlords, right? And how the issues. Why does a landlord not want it?
There are so many little buzzwords and catchphrases thrown in that answer by Ryan. I don't know where to start. It was a great answer from a tenant's perspective. But I think, the most important thing we need to remember as developers and landlords is that co-tenancy was what caused, in large part, some of the big failures of 2007, 8, and 9.
Mm-hmm.
They used to be given all the time. And entire centers and developers fell apart because of co-tenancy rights that were liberally granted. I do think that for some national tenants that are not anchors, that to ask for or expect some level of co-tenancy is reasonable. I think the landlord's got to have flexibility, so if the anchor goes out of business, that anchor can be replaced. Think, Circuit City, for instance. There are other examples where we never could have guessed someone was going out of business, and they did. So if you can have those protections on the downside, and when things fail, you may be okay.
Well, stay tuned. We'll have more on negotiating leases. I'm Michael Bull. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. We'll be right back. The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you in part by your friends at Bull Realty. When your business requires proven performance, visit bullrealty.com or call 800-408-BULL. Welcome back to the Commercial Real Estate Show. I'm Michael Bull. Today we're talking about sales and lease negotiations. We're concentrating on leases right now. We have John Neville, who's playing the part of the landlord rep, and we have Ryan Rivera, who's playing the part of the tenant side. And guys, I'd like now to talk about lease renewal options. So Ryan's client, the tenant, wants the renewal option when their lease expires in 5 years. They want to be able to renew the lease at a set rate, and they want that locked in to be able to have that option. They'd like to give 2 months notice prior to give that to exercise that option. And John, you represent the landlord. He doesn't like tenant renewal options. He doesn't want it at all. All right, first of all, why, Ryan, does the tenant want these renewal options?
Yeah, first of all, I want more than one option.
Of course you do.
But as a tenant, I'm investing a lot into the space. I'm investing a lot into the shopping center, if we're talking in the retail world, or it might be an office building. And if my business is performing well, I want the ability to control that space and to stay for not only potentially an additional 5 years, but longer. So again, in light of how much I'm investing into the space, and if my operations are performing well, I want to make sure that I can kind of stick around on my own terms.
And why do you need the rent set, that you have a set amount of that rent 5 years from now?
Well, that way I know going in with certainty, and you said, giving kind of 60 days notice. I know when my notice date comes, what I'm looking at, what my rent exposure is going to be going forward. You see some deals where maybe they look at alternatives where it's not a fixed rent, and that is a situation where, as a tenant, I actually don't like that because, while it might be a fair market rent or some other sort of calculation, I don't know with certainty at that point what my rent exposure will be.
Okay, and why, John, as a landlord, do you not want this tenant to have these renewal rights?
It's a one-way street.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I have no commitment, but yet he's asking for a commitment from me.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. It's predictability for my asset and asset value. I can't say for certainty in year 11, for instance, if it's a 10-year deal with a 5-year option, I can't say for certainty that I'm going to have a tenant in year 11. On the other hand, he can say for certainty that if he wants a store in year 11, as long as he doesn't default, he's going to get it.
And it's a big problem in the last year of that lease, right?
Well, the 60 days notice is ridiculous. We would never, ever agree. I would say, even in trying to be objective, I think the fair window is 180 days, 6 months. And typically our deals will say closer to a year. And the reason is that you need time to be able to find a replacement tenant for that space. Okay. In no way, shape, or form in 60 days can you find a replacement tenant, get a deal signed, and someone else open. So, out of everything you've said that was offensive, that was the most offensive.
So what's a way that you could compromise? What's another solution from the landlord side that you could give the tenant to make them feel good?
Well, I think number one, you could have the options tied to performance. We have seen that, because if the tenant's being successful, landlord's going to want them there too. So you possibly can say that as long as the tenant's sales are X number of dollars per square foot, then in that case the tenant will have an option. And Ryan's not going to like that because that sort of takes some control away from his tenant. But my logic there as an owner is that, probably a tenant that's performing that well is not going to want to leave anyway. And frankly, if the tenant's performing that well, they're really benefiting my development. We want to give them that right, that inducement to stay and that certainty. As compared to a tenant who's failing, the last thing we want is a failing tenant renewing.
And how about the set rental rate? You going to let that happen, or would you like something else as a landlord?
It depends. I mean, I sort of actually agree with Ryan on this one, that I think the set rental rate gives some predictability. Fair market value is an open door to negotiate. And it can be complicated, it can be expensive, it can get more brokers involved, no offense, but people give the attorney jokes all the time, so we'll make a broker crack
Excellent.
here.
I like
but a fixed rent, if it's calculated correctly, I think can benefit both parties.
And we do see a lot of these leases come back where the landlord says, yeah, I'll give you a renewal option, but it's going to be at a market rate. What would you say on the tenant side when the landlord comes back and say it's going to be market rate at the time?
I think the challenge when you do a market rate option is it gets very complicated. You have one party that's going to present their proposal for fair market value. Most likely that'll be the landlord initiating the proposal. As a tenant, I'm certain to disagree with that most likely.
Yeah.
So then you get into the kind of the process for trying to reach and agree upon a number, and that's not always easy to do. One compromise that I've seen where you have a landlord not wanting to give an option, instead of a 5-year initial term with 5 years at market rent, I've seen some clients, I'll say, look, I'll do a 10-year initial term, but give me a gross sales kickout. So that would obviously be in the retail sector, where if my store is not performing well in year 4, I have the ability, at least at that point, to make an election to terminate and walk away, or I'll stay committed and commit to the full 10-year term.
And these kick-out clauses can be problematic for a landlord, can't they?
Well, I mean, it's the other side of the coin of what I was just describing. A kick-out clause can be problematic, but, I mean, they are becoming increasingly common, I think, with brands that are national and successful that maybe are especially expanding into a new market.
Yeah, and I agree they are. It can be a challenge for the landlord, because when the landlord's trying to finance it or sell it, the lender and the buyer are looking at it. Well, if you got the tenant has a kick out in 3 years, that's a 3-year lease to them a lot of times.
Even as a landlord, though, my comment to that would be, and listen, I would rather not have a kick out at all. Ryan knows that. But if I'm having to negotiate a kick out, the logic is, again, I do not want a poor performing store in my development anyway.
Yeah.
It pulls down the value of my development. So if I'm going to do a kick out, I want it a mutual kick out. I want the right to be able to say, if their sales aren't $1 million, if that's the magic number, that either the tenant or the landlord can terminate, and that allows me to protect my asset.
Great discussions. Let's move on to another aspect of leases that could sometimes be extremely important and are negotiated pretty strongly in some leases, and that's strong tenant self-help clauses, where a tenant has the right, if the landlord doesn't perform some maintenance or other things involving the property, the tenant can come in and do it. So, Ryan, the tenant wants really strong worded self-help clauses. They can fix the roof, they can pay the mortgage, they can do a lot of things. Why do they need all that?
You missed a few areas. We also want the ability to go into the common areas as well, parking field, critical access points, and exercise self-help there if they're not maintained. It's, I think it comes down to, if I'm representing an anchor tenant versus maybe a local or a small shop, there's a distinction. If I'm representing an anchor tenant, that parking field, the common areas and maybe the sidewalks, access points, those really are, I view those as part of my space.
Right.
They're critical to my business. So that's going to be an area where if the landlord is not maintaining and repairing properly, I do want the ability to exercise self-help.
Yeah.
If I'm a local kind of small shop tenant, I'm going to ask for those self-help rights. I know John's going to want to limit them, though.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give them. I think we actually agree on this to some degree. I think if you're an anchor tenant, it is reasonable most of the time to be able to establish a critical area that has to be maintained. Yeah. And it's not the entire development, but it is an area that's in reasonable proximity to that anchor space, that if it weren't maintained, that anchor could be in trouble.
Yeah, but the landlord doesn't want, the landlord knows he's going to have a roof he has to replace at times. He's going to have things. He doesn't want the tenant getting involved.
Michael,
right?
We're never giving self-help on the roof. I mean, and in seriousness, the roof is something, it goes into the weeds a little bit, but the roof and other components of the property have warranties.
So that's an alternative, right, is to do self-help on some items and
Absolutely
not others?
Correct.
And specify?
No. Because that's the area where I'm probably have the most concern, roof leaks.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you start talking about water intruding into the space that could damage personal property, could present safety issues.
And you're going to indemnify me then. If my roof warranty goes away because of some self-help that you exercise, then I need a full indemnity and to be made whole.
If your roofing contractor is readily accessible, if the cost is reasonable, I will agree to use your roofing contractor. But if I can't get a hold of that individual or that company, and there's a leak, and all of a sudden we have a safety issue, I guess what we call an emergency type repair, I may not guarantee that.
Well, and I think an emergency may be a different circumstance, but at the end of the day, I think anytime a tenant takes something into their own hands, there's risk.
Yeah.
Anytime a landlord doesn't perform an obligation under a lease, there's risk. And all this is a risk assessment as to how far does a tenant or landlord want to push the issue.
Yeah.
But to your point, a smaller shop tenant, typically if that tenant can get self-help within their space, they've done pretty well.
Right, and it does depend on the deal, how bad the tenant needs the space, how bad the landlord needs the tenant, right? Gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate good points.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, stay tuned. We're going to work on a sales contract next. I'm Michael Bull. This is the Commercial Real Estate Show. Stay with us. The Commercial Real Estate Show is brought to you by Bull Realty, a great place to do business. Xceligent, information for the professionals. And Commercial Search, properties for sale and lease. To access these companies or for additional videos, podcasts, and articles, visit creshow.com.